In the 1920s, the Community Church of Boston was part of the Sacco and Vanzetti Defense Committee. Community Church has memorialized them every year since their execution by the state of Massachusetts in 1927. The members of the Board of Directors of the Church are honored to present the 11th Annual Sacco Vanzetti Memorial Award for Struggles for Social Justice to Cesar Chavez, President and founder of the United Farm Workers of America, AFL-CIO. You see, the program contains a write-up of Cesar Chavez, Masha Traber, President of the Community Church, and I will present the award to Cesar Chavez at this time on behalf of our people.
Sacco Vanzetti Memorial Award presented to Cesar Chavez on April 13, 1986 by the Community Church of Boston. This award is presented to Cesar Chavez for his steadfast struggle to turn the wrath of grace into the fruit of life for farm workers and consumers alike. What I wish more than all in this last hour of agony is that our taste and our faith may be understood in their real being and serve as a tremendous lesson to the forces of freedom, so that our suffering and death will not have been in vain. Bartolomeo Vanzetti. I'm honored to present this to Cesar Chavez.
I'm proud to present to you a man who fights with his faith and not with his fists, a man whose commitment to justice is determined by as long as it takes, a man who cares deeply for farm workers and consumers alike, a man who is turning the wrath of grapes into the fruit of life for everyone. Cesar Chavez, whose address is called The Wrath of Grapes. Cesar Chavez. This is the note.
Thank you very much, Reverend Alberts, and thank you very much, community of the Community Church of Boston. You honor me with a presentation. And the best way to honor the work and the ultimate sacrifice by Sacco and Vanzetti is to continue their work for the liberation of the working people, in particular in this case, for the farm workers of the United States. "21 years ago, last September, on a lonely stretch of railroad paralleling U.S. Highway 101 near Salinas, California, 32 bracero farm workers lost their lives in a tragic accident. The braceros had been imported from Mexico to work in California farms. They died when their bus, which was converted from a flatbed truck, drove in front of a freight train. Conversion of the bus had not been approved by any government agency. The driver had tunnel vision. Most of the bodies laid unidentified for days. No one including the grower who employed the workers, even knew their names. Today, thousands of farm workers live under savage conditions, beneath trees and amid garbage and human excrement, near the fields where they work, fields which use the most modern farm technology. Vicious rats gnaw on them as they sleep. They walk miles to buy food at inflated prices, and they carry water from irrigation ditches. Child labor is common in many farm areas today. As much as 30% of Northern California's garlic harvesters are underage children. Kids as young as 6 years old have voted in state-conducted union elections since they qualified as workers. Some 800,000 underage children work with their families harvesting crops across America. Babies born to migrant workers suffer 25% higher infant mortality rate than the rest of the population. Malnutrition among migrant worker children is 10 times higher than the national rate. The farm workers' average life expectancy is still 49 years. Farm workers are being killed and maimed because of exposure to toxic pesticides. The Wrath of Grapes campaign symbolizes the threats posed to farm workers and consumers by the reckless use of deadly poisons in agriculture. This fight is not about ideology or philosophy or partisanship. When farm workers' rights are not enforced, it doesn't represent a momentary political advantage for one side or the other. It means life or death for the poorest and most abused workers in our land. Take the life and death of Juan Chaboya, age 34. Last August 5th, Juan was working at the Mirada Farms near Jamul in rural San Diego County. When he was ordered to enter a field sprayed only an hour before, which is illegal, the highly toxic pesticide monitor. Several hours later, he collapsed in the field. A co-worker told the grower, but instead of driving him to a nearby hospital, Juan was taken across the Mexican border and left at a Tijuana clinic. He was dead on arrival. 24-year-old Prisciliano Calvillo was sent to spray Dynasep without proper protective clothing along canals in Kern County 3 months ago. A hose broke, splashed the pesticide in his eye, and he's now losing the vision on that eye. Agricultural communities in the San Joaquin Valley, towns of McFarland and Fowler in Kern and Fresno counties, are now considered cancer clusters. That means that in those two communities, the incidence of leukemia among children ages 2 to 11 is anywhere from 450 to 600% higher than the national average. In McFarland, California, 7 miles from where I live, in the last 2 years, in a 3-block area, 11 cases of cancer among children, 4 are already dead. And 3 weeks ago, 3 more cases came up. In Delano, California, 3 years ago, a young woman working in the vineyards had been sprayed with Captan, went to work. She was 1 month pregnant. 8 months later, a little boy was born. Juan Franco was born without arms and without legs. And we have just done a documentary film which will be showing, I'm sure, in your church someday soon. How protected are citizens throughout the state of California where pesticide contamination of groundwater is rampant? California does not lead the nation in protection of the food supply as some people think. The California Department of Food and Agriculture has adopted with all of its flaws and inadequacies, the federal government system of determining how much pesticide residue will be allowed in food. These maximum permissible levels or tolerances are considered to be safe. This is clearly a case of the blind leading the blind, since most of these so-called safe levels are based on faulty, inaccurate, inconclusive, incomplete, and even fraudulent data on the chronic toxicity of these pesticides. That is, their ability to cause cancer, birth defects, changes in genetic material, and nervous system disease, among other effects. Under such circumstances, the public should be concerned about pesticide contamination of their food. How should the public react when they discover that their air, water, soil, and food are contaminated with residues of carcinogenic or highly toxic agricultural chemicals? The California Department of Food and Agriculture does not have data on safe levels of pesticides which cause cancer or other chronic effects. The California Department of Food and Agriculture has done no epidemiological or other research to back up such levels. These levels do not reflect regional and ethnic differences in patterns of food consumption. These levels do not reflect consumption by infants, the ill, the elderly, or the pregnant women. Should we be content to allow decisions about residues, known and suspect carcinogenic pesticides on food to be based solely on economic impact on the agricultural and chemical industry? Shouldn't consideration of human life and health be more important? We say so. We propose the immediate banning of 5 pesticides used in grape production: phosphrin, Dynaseb, methylbromide, Captan, and parathion, all organophosphates. Parathion and phosphrin are insecticides. Together, they have caused more farm workers' death and serious poisonings than any other organophosphate or nerve gas type poison in the history of pesticides. Workers have died from residue poisoning of these 2 poisons. Phosphrin is highly lethal, causes death very quickly. Workers exposed to it are at very high risk. Dynaseb is a highly active compound that recently caused a farm worker's death in Texas. It should be banned before another worker is killed or blinded. Methylbromide is extraordinarily toxic, carcinogenic, and highly lethal. It is responsible for more occupational deaths in California, that is, farm workers and non-farm workers, than any other single pesticide. Doesn't the consumer have the right to know whether or not such a highly toxic and dangerous fumigant is on the food they feed their children? The California Department of Food and Agriculture testing has found residues of methylbromide on grapes. Captan is a carcinogen and causes birth defects. EPA proposed to ban it because of the unacceptable human health risks, but bow to industry pressure to keep it on the market. It should have never been introduced in the first place. Captan is the worst of all, and they're all pretty bad. It is a good example to show that tolerances are set politically and not scientifically. For example, Canada allows only 5 parts per million, that is 5 milligrams per kilogram of residue on grapes, while in the United States we allow 10 times as much, 50 parts per million. New Zealand allows 10 parts, and most of Europe 15 parts. We allow 50 parts. You know why? Because Captan residue and levels are always testing about 15 and 20 parts per million. Captan is very heavily used and is a widespread contaminant of food supply. Residues of Captan were found on grapes tested by the California Department of Food and Agriculture, and also on a challenge by me in Ohio 6-7 months ago when I made a statement there, and one of the newspapers challenged my statement. We I challenged them back by saying, let's get the Department of Health in your state, let's test grapes. They did, and they found Cap 10 on the grapes. And they didn't bother me after that. The California Department of Food and Agriculture tested 144 samples of grapes in 1984. 11 different pesticides were found. 1 is banned, 1 is not registered for use in grapes, 5 are proven or suspect carcinogen, and 4 are proven or suspect to cause birth defects. The fact that they are below the tolerance level gives little comfort considering the serious deficiencies already described. Most pesticides cannot be washed off by the consumer. Most pesticide formulations emphasize broad contact and adherence to the spray crop for best possible pest control. The nature of the plant surface and the composition of pesticide formulation assures penetration into most foods. Clearly, we are seeing only the tip of the iceberg because of weaknesses and loopholes in pesticide regulation and enforcement big enough to drive a spray rig right through. In 1984, there were 1,470 notices of violations and 3,000 notices of warning issued by the California Department of Food and Agriculture for violations of the Agricultural Code, and only 8 prosecutions. Growers who apply illegal pesticides to watermelon, remember that one? And grapes have not been brought to justice yet. And there were illegal applications. We have been concerned about the health effects of pesticides and have made it a part of the organizing and collective bargaining of our union for more than 20 years. In the interest of worker and consumer health and safety, we feel a responsibility to bring to the attention of the American people and the congregation of the Community Church here in Boston evidence that certain pesticides cannot be used safely on grapes or other food. In California, for example, pesticide use has tripled during the last 2 decades. Farmers there now spend nearly $1 billion on agricultural chemicals each year. Meanwhile, damage for insects, weeds, and disease has increased by 40%. We're using more pesticides, but we're losing the battle. Pesticides applied to farmland in California, San Joaquin Valley, the nation's richest agricultural region, have seeped into the underground reservoirs over a 7,000 square mile corridor, contaminating the drinking water of 1 million residents or more. In an editorial in the Fresno Bee, the largest paper in the valley, in January of this year, entitled Data Gap About Pesticides, let me quote that. Not surprisingly, there's argument about the real meaning of the pesticide report that had to be dragged out of the California Department of Food and Agriculture. The report, a monument to bureaucratic reluctance, demonstrates that for its California Department of Food and Agriculture should have careful studies on the safety of the hundreds of pesticides licensed in California, there is a large black hole. Of the 700-odd compounds used in the state, California Department of Food and Agriculture has completed studies on no more than half a dozen. The rest are either inadequate or haven't been filed at all. We have proposed to the California table grape industry and the Table Grape Commission to join with us, to have a testing program where the union and the industry would jointly test throughout the United States, random testing of grapes. We would select jointly what date, which place, what supermarket, which bunch of grapes, what kind of grapes, and then do the testing and then make the results of the testing on pesticide residue public, give it to the public. Of course, they don't want to do that. They have no excuse, they don't want to do it, and they get very upset when we make that suggestion. But they have responded in their own way. From the Bakersfield Californian, last August, let me read you from that article. The Table Grape Commission charges that the United Farm Workers president is making false claims that consumers and farm workers are threatened by pesticide-contaminated table grapes, and contends that these statements violate the Federal Anti-Tampering Act. The U.S. Attorney's Office doesn't consider this matter worth prosecuting because it is not a violation of the Act, said Greg Beauchamp, Regional Inspector General for the Investigations for the United States Department of Agriculture Office of the Inspector General. In this case, Beauchamp said, the Act would be violated only if false statements were made concerning the application of pesticides. He said, it's well known that pesticides are on the grapes. The Table Grape Commission is trying to get the federal government to indict me for tampering with information on pesticides and grapes. I shall continue to do it, even from jail, if I should be so lucky. These tragic events forced farm workers to declare a new international boycott of California fresh table grapes. Not wines and not raisins, only the seedless and the seeded. The white, the yellow, the black, and the red grapes, the ones you buy at the stores. We're asking all of you to join with us and not to eat them. For the reasons I've given you, but also for your own protection. And also because there's a very good beginning here that we may be able to repeat what we did back in 1970. After 5 years of boycotting grapes, we were the first and only organization in the United States, with your help, to get the table grape industry to ban. That is ban. The word ban is a no-no word in the industry. To ban DDT, DDE, and deodorant, the hard pesticides. We did that with your help, and we can do it again. On September 8, 1965, Delano farm workers began an epic battle to improve wages and working conditions. 20 years later, we're convinced economic gains mean little when toxic poisons threaten our lives and our health. Through the first grape boycott, we touched the hearts and consciences of good people across America by letting them know about the indignities endured by California farm workers and their families. We let the people know about the daily abuses grape workers suffered. We also let people know about what pesticides did to farm workers and their families. We dramatically transformed the simple act of refusing to buy grapes into a powerful statement against poverty and injustice and poisonings. The grape boycott became a rallying cry for millions of Americans who never worked on a farm. During the 60s and 70s, millions of people, 17 million according to one nationwide poll, rallied to the cause of the grape workers in Delano. On the 20th anniversary of the Delano grape strike, we're declaring war on the pesticide poisoning of farm workers, consumers, and the nation's food supply. 2 decades ago, the first grape boycott fought for human dignity, basic economic rights. Today, the grape boycott fights to protect farm workers, their children, consumers and their children from pesticide poisoning. We will achieve victory in this new battle by forging a noble nationwide alliance of farm workers and consumers. We'll go to the American people and tell them the truth. Your food is being poisoned. Contaminated watermelon and poisoned cheese have conditioned people to accept the idea that something is wrong with the food they buy. Millions of people are prepared to accept this fact. The message of the new grape boycott is that consumers can protect themselves by boycotting grapes. And that boycott, brothers and sisters, will force growers to bargain in good faith for contracts which will protect us from the fearful perils of pesticides. This war on pesticides will be a reality indeed as well as in pronouncement. Already we have mailed hundreds of thousands of letters to consumers appealing to them to boycott grapes because of the poison threat. Pesticides will now become the focus of the grape boycott activity throughout North America. There's really no choice to be made. There's no decision to debate. There is nothing more important to us than our health and the lives of our children. And there is nothing more important that we share in common with you, the consumers of America, than the safety of the nation's food supply, which we both depend upon. With this weapon in a nonviolent arsenal and with the unbounded support our cause continues to enjoy from the American people, we shall win in the end. You can count on it. The growers only have themselves to blame for the humiliation that they have brought upon succeeding waves of immigrant groups that have sweated and sacrificed for over 100 years to make that industry rich. For generations, they have subjugated entire races of dark-skinned farm workers. These are the sins of the growers, not the farm workers. We didn't poison the land. We haven't poisoned the people. We didn't covet billions of dollars in government handouts. We didn't abuse and exploit the people who work the land. The times are changing. The political and social environment will change. The chickens are coming home to roost, and the time to account for past sins is approaching. I am told these days why farm workers should be discouraged and pessimistic. The Republicans control the governor's office in the White House. There's a conservative trend in the nation. But my friends, we are filled with hope and encouragement. We have looked into the future, and the future is ours. History and inevitability are on our side. The farm workers and their children, and the Hispanics and their children are the future of California, and not corporate growers. They're the past. Those politicians who ally themselves with the corporate growers and against the farm workers and the Hispanics are in for a big surprise. They want to make their careers in politics. They want to hold power 20 and 30 years from now. But 20 and 30 years from now, in Modesto, in Salinas, in McFarland, in Fowler, in Delano, and in other cities of California, those communities will be dominated by farm workers and not by growers, by the children and grandchildren of farm workers and not by the children and grandchildren of growers. These trends are part of the forces of history which cannot be stopped. No person and no organization can resist them for very long. They are inevitable. Once social change begins, they cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. Our opponents must understand that it's not just a union we have built. Unions, like other institutions, can come and go. But we're more than an institution. For nearly 20 years, our union has been on the cutting edge of a people's cause. And you cannot do away with an entire people. You cannot stamp out a people's cause. Regardless of what the future holds for the union, regardless of what the future holds for farm workers, our accomplishments cannot be undone. La causa, our cause, doesn't have to be experienced twice. The consciousness and pride that were raised by our union are alive and thriving inside thousands of young farm workers. Like the other immigrant groups, the day will come when we win the economic and political rewards that are in keeping with our numbers and our contributions to society. The day will come when the politicians will do the right thing by our people out of political necessity and not out of charity or idealism. That day may not come this year. That day may not come during this decade. But it will come someday. And when that day comes, we shall see the fulfillment of that passage from the book of Matthew in the New Testament, that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And on that day, our nation shall fulfill its creed, and that fulfillment shall enrich us all. Thank you very much.
Going to receive the collection now for the United Farm Workers. I urge you to give as generously as you're able to help this very important effort. The ushers will take the collection at this time, and then we will go into a brief question period before the reception honoring Cesar Chavez.